The summer of 1851, in Natchez, Mississippi, was hotter than hell itself. The cotton fields stretched for miles under the burning sun, and the sounds of suffering filled the air from dawn until dusk. But the real horrors didn't happen in the fields. They happened after dark, when the wealthy plantation owners gathered for their secret entertainment. James Thornton owned one of the largest plantations in Mississippi. He was known for three things: his cruelty, his wealth, and his fighting rings. Every few weeks, he would invite other rich white men to his property for an evening of gambling and violence. They would drink expensive whiskey, smoke cigars, and watch enslaved people fight each other until blood covered the dirt floor. The crowds loved it. They would bet thousands of dollars on which slave would win, which one would fall first, and how long the fights would last. Thornton had a special technique that made him different from other plantation owners who ran fighting rings. While others chose the biggest and strongest slaves to fight, Thornton did the opposite. He picked the weakest ones. He would find the smallest, thinnest, most helpless-looking people on his plantation and throw them into the ring against much larger opponents. The crowds thought it was hilarious. They loved watching the weak ones get destroyed in seconds. It made them feel powerful. It made them laugh, and it made Thornton very rich. On his plantation, there was a man named Samuel. He was quiet, kept to himself, and looked like a strong wind could knock him over. His arms were thin, his shoulders were narrow, and he walked with his head down like he was afraid of his own shadow. The other enslaved people tried to protect him because he seemed so fragile. The overseers barely noticed him because he never caused any trouble. He picked cotton slowly, ate his small portions of food without complaint, and disappeared into his cabin every night without saying a word to anyone. Thornton had seen Samuel working in the fields and thought he was perfect for his next fighting event. He told his overseer to grab Samuel and prepare him for the ring. The overseer laughed and said it would be the shortest fight in history. Thornton smiled and agreed. He had already invited 50 wealthy men to watch, and he had promised them the most entertaining evening of their lives. He planned to bet against Samuel himself and make a fortune when the weak slave got knocked down in the first few seconds. But James Thornton didn't know the truth about Samuel. Nobody did, and that one mistake would change everything. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy, and let us know in the comments which city and country are you listening from. Your presence ensures these stories are never truly forgotten. The fighting rings in Mississippi weren't just about entertainment. They were about power, control, and money. Plantation owners across the South had been running these brutal events since the early 1800s, but James Thornton had turned it into an art form. He built a special barn behind his main house where no one from the outside could see what was happening. The barn had thick wooden walls, no windows, and a dirt floor that was always stained dark brown from dried blood. In the center, there was a circular area marked with white chalk where the fights took place. Around the circle, there were wooden benches arranged in rows so the spectators could sit comfortably while they watched human beings destroy each other. Thornton sent out invitations on expensive paper to the wealthiest men in Natchez and the surrounding counties. Doctors, lawyers, merchants, and other plantation owners would arrive in their finest clothes, riding in fancy carriages pulled by beautiful horses. They treated these events like theater performances or dinner parties. Their wives had no idea where they were going. The men told lies about business meetings or card games, then they would disappear into Thornton's barn for hours. Inside the barn, servants would pour drinks and light cigars while the guests settled into their seats. Thornton always started the evening with a speech. He would stand in the center of the ring and welcome everyone, making jokes about which slaves would fight that night. The crowd would laugh and shout suggestions. Then the betting would begin. Men would wave money in the air, calling out amounts and making wagers with each other. Some bets were simple, like picking the winner. Other bets were more cruel, like guessing how many times a slave would fall down before staying down, or how much blood would cover the floor by the end. The fights themselves were barbaric. Thornton's overseers would drag two enslaved people into the ring, often people who didn't want to fight at all. They would be forced to attack each other while the crowd screamed and cheered. There were no rules, no time limits, and no mercy. Fighters used their fists, their feet, and sometimes makeshift weapons that Thornton provided. The fights continued until one person couldn't stand up anymore, or until Thornton decided he was bored and wanted to move on to the next match. What made Thornton's event special was his twisted strategy of choosing the weakest fighters. Other plantation owners wanted to see evenly matched battles between strong men, but Thornton understood crowd psychology better. He knew that wealthy white men enjoyed watching power imbalances. They liked seeing someone completely helpless getting dominated by someone stronger. It made them feel superior. It reminded them of their position in society. When a tiny, weak slave got thrown into the ring against a massive opponent, the crowd would go wild with excitement. They would laugh before the fight even started, already knowing how it would end. Thornton made thousands of dollars from these events. He charged admission fees, took percentages from the betting pools, and even sold special seats closer to the ring for extra money. His reputation grew across Mississippi as the man who provided the most entertaining and profitable fighting nights in the entire state. Samuel had been on Thornton's plantation for almost 3 years, but nobody really knew anything about him. He arrived in the spring of 1848 on a slave trader's wagon, along with 12 other people who had been bought at an auction in New Orleans. From the very first day, he seemed different from the others. While most new arrivals showed anger, sadness, or fear in their eyes, Samuel showed nothing. His face was blank, like he had already accepted whatever terrible things were coming next. He was assigned to work in the cotton fields with about 40 other enslaved people. His body looked weak compared to the other men. His arms were thin, and his chest was narrow. He stood about 5 feet 7 inches tall, which was shorter than most of the male slaves on the plantation. His hands were small, and his fingers were long and delicate. Not the thick, calloused hands you would expect from someone who worked in fields. The overseers noticed this, and often made jokes about him, calling him names and laughing at how pathetic he looked. Every morning, Samuel would wake up before dawn and walk slowly to the fields with the others. He never talked during the walk. He never sang the songs that other enslaved people sang to make the work easier. He just moved quietly, like a shadow. In the fields, he picked cotton at a slower pace than everyone else. The overseers would yell at him and sometimes hit him with their whips, but he never fought back or complained. He would just nod his head and continue working at the same slow pace. During meal times, Samuel sat alone. The plantation provided terrible food, usually just cornmeal mush, and sometimes a small piece of salt pork. While other enslaved people gathered in groups to eat and talk, Samuel would take his portion and find a spot away from everyone else. He would eat slowly, chewing each bite carefully, staring at the ground the whole time. Some people thought he was simple-minded. Others thought he was just broken inside from whatever horrors he had experienced before arriving at the plantation. In the evenings, after the work was done, the other enslaved people would sometimes gather to tell stories, sing spirituals, or talk about their families they had been separated from. Samuel never joined these gatherings. He would go straight to his small cabin, which he shared with 3 other men, and lie down on his thin straw mat. He would stare at the ceiling in the darkness, not sleeping but not really awake either. His cabin mates tried to talk to him during the first few months, asking where he came from or if he had family somewhere. Samuel never answered. After a while, they stopped asking and just left him alone. The elderly women on the plantation felt sorry for him. They thought he wouldn't survive long because he looked so fragile and acted so strange. They would sometimes sneak him extra food or a warmer blanket during winter, trying to keep him alive. Samuel would accept these gifts with a small nod, but never smiled or showed gratitude. He just existed, day after day, looking like someone who had given up on life completely. Samuel wasn't born a slave. He was born free in a village on the coast of West Africa, in what is now Ghana. His real name was Kwame, and he came from the Ashanti people, a warrior tribe known throughout the region for their strength and fighting skills. From the time he was a small boy, Kwame was trained in the ancient combat methods that had been passed down through generations of Ashanti warriors. His father and uncles taught him how to move quickly, how to read an opponent's body language, and how to use his smaller size as an advantage rather than a weakness. The Ashanti fighting style was completely different from the brutal brawling that happened in American slave fighting rings. It focused on speed, precision, and strategy rather than raw power. Kwame learned how to strike vital points on the human body that could disable an opponent in seconds. He was taught breathing techniques that helped him stay calm during combat. He practiced footwork patterns that made him difficult to hit, while allowing him to attack from unexpected angles. By the time he was 16 years old, Kwame had fought in 3 tribal conflicts and had never been defeated. His life changed forever in 1847 when he was 22 years old. European slave traders had been raiding villages along the coast for decades. But Kwame's village was protected by its warriors and its location. One night, a group of traders attacked with guns and overwhelming numbers. Kwame fought hard, taking down several men before someone hit him from behind and knocked him unconscious. When he woke up, he was chained in the bottom of a slave ship with hundreds of other captured Africans. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean took 6 weeks. Many people died during the crossing from disease, starvation, and despair. Kwame survived by shutting down emotionally. He stopped thinking about his home, his family, and his life as a warrior. He decided that if he was going to live, he needed to become invisible. When the ship arrived in New Orleans, he was sold at an auction to a trader who specialized in buying slaves cheap and selling them to plantations in Mississippi. On Thornton's plantation, Kwame became Samuel, a name given to him by the overseer, who couldn't pronounce his African name. He made a conscious decision to hide everything about who he really was. He walked slowly even though he could move like lightning. He acted weak even though his body was still trained and strong. He kept his muscles lean and undefined by eating small portions and avoiding any movements that would show his true physical abilities. He watched the overseers and studied their patterns, learning when they paid attention and when they didn't. Every night, in his cabin, when the others were asleep, Samuel would practice his fighting techniques in tiny, invisible movements. He would tense and release specific muscle groups to keep them ready. He would practice breathing exercises in complete silence. He would visualize fights in his mind, running through combinations and strategies. He knew that someday his hidden skills might be useful, but until that day came, he would remain perfectly disguised as the weakest, most harmless slave on the entire plantation. The night of August 15, 1851, was when everything changed. Thornton had invited over 50 men to his barn for what he promised would be the most entertaining fight of the year. He had been bragging for weeks about finding the perfect victim, a slave so weak and pathetic that the fight would be over in less than a minute. The guests arrived in their expensive carriages, laughing and drinking before they even entered the barn. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of whiskey. The wooden benches were packed with men in fine suits, all eager to see blood and place their bets. Thornton stood in the center of the ring and raised his hands to quiet the crowd. He announced that tonight's main event would feature 2 fighters with an extreme size difference. First, he brought out a man named Big John, a massive enslaved man who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed close to 250 pounds. Big John had fought in Thornton's ring 3 times before and had won every match by knocking his opponents unconscious within minutes. The crowd cheered when they saw him. Men immediately started shouting out bets, convinced that Big John would destroy whoever faced him. Then Thornton's overseers dragged Samuel into the ring. The crowd exploded with laughter. Samuel looked tiny compared to Big John. His thin arms hung at his sides, and his head was down, just like always. He appeared terrified, his body shaking slightly as he stood in the chalk circle. The contrast was absurd. It looked like a grown man about to fight a child. The guests were screaming with excitement, making jokes about how this wasn't even a fair fight. Some men bet on how many seconds Samuel would last. Others bet on which part of his body Big John would break first. Thornton stood between the 2 fighters, and explained the rules, which were simple. The fight continued until one man couldn't stand anymore. No weapons were allowed, but everything else was permitted. He looked at Samuel with a cruel smile and asked if he understood. Samuel nodded slowly, still keeping his head down. Thornton stepped out of the ring and shouted for the fight to begin. The crowd leaned forward in their seats, ready to watch a massacre. Big John charged at Samuel immediately, his huge fists ready to crush the smaller man. But something impossible happened in the next 2 seconds. Samuel's entire body changed. His posture straightened. His eyes lifted and locked onto Big John with a focus that hadn't been there before. As Big John's massive fist came toward his face, Samuel moved with speed that seemed inhuman. He shifted his body to the side so smoothly that Big John's punch hit nothing but air. Before Big John could recover his balance, Samuel struck him 3 times in rapid succession, once in the throat, once in the solar plexus, and once behind the knee. Big John made a choking sound and fell forward onto the dirt. The entire barn went completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. They had just witnessed something that their minds couldn't process. James Thornton's face turned white as he watched Big John struggling to breathe on the ground. The massive man was clutching his throat, gasping for air, completely defeated in less than 5 seconds. The crowd sat frozen in shock, their drinks halfway to their mouths, their cigars burning unnoticed in their hands. This wasn't supposed to happen. This went against everything they understood about power and control. The weak didn't defeat the strong. The helpless didn't win. That wasn't how their world worked. Thornton's mind was racing with panic. He had bet $2,000 of his own money against Samuel, confident it was the easiest money he would ever make. Now that money was gone. But the financial loss was nothing compared to the bigger problem standing in front of him. He had a slave who had been hiding extraordinary fighting abilities for 3 years. A slave who had made him look like a fool in front of the most powerful men in Mississippi. A slave who had just destroyed his reputation in under 10 seconds. The other plantation owners in the crowd started whispering to each other. Their faces showed a mix of shock and something darker, suspicion. They were looking at Thornton differently now. If he didn't know what was happening with his own slaves, what else didn't he know? How could they trust doing business with a man who couldn't control his own property? Several men stood up and left the barn immediately, without saying goodbye, disgusted that they had wasted their evening and lost their bets on what they thought was a sure thing. Thornton's overseer, a brutal man named Cooper, rushed into the ring and grabbed Samuel by the arm, but Samuel didn't resist or try to run. He immediately returned to his weak, helpless posture. His shoulders slumped forward, his head dropped down, and his eyes went blank again. It was like watching someone put on a mask. Cooper dragged him out of the ring while other overseers helped Big John to his feet. The large man was humiliated and angry, coughing and holding his throat, unable to understand how someone so small had hurt him so badly. Thornton ordered everyone to leave his property. The guests filed out of the barn in uncomfortable silence, none of them making eye contact with him. He could hear them talking and laughing once they got outside, and he knew they were laughing at him. By tomorrow morning, every plantation owner in 3 counties would know the story of how James Thornton got humiliated by his own slave. His fighting ring business was destroyed. No one would come to his events anymore. No one would take him seriously. But Thornton's biggest fear was something else entirely. He was terrified of what Samuel represented. If one slave could hide his true abilities so completely for years, how many others were doing the same thing? How many enslaved people on his plantation were secretly stronger, smarter, or more dangerous than they appeared? The thought made his blood run cold. He realized that he didn't actually control these people the way he thought he did. They were just pretending to be controlled, waiting for the right moment. That night, Thornton locked himself in his study and drank an entire bottle of whiskey while trying to decide what to do with Samuel. He had 3 options, and each one came with terrible consequences. The first option was to kill Samuel immediately. A public execution would send a message to every enslaved person on the plantation that resistance and deception would not be tolerated. It would show the other plantation owners that Thornton was still in control. But there was a problem with this approach. Samuel hadn't actually broken any rules. He had fought when ordered to fight, and he had won. Killing him for winning would make Thornton look weak and afraid, which was exactly what he was trying to avoid. The second option was to sell Samuel to a slave trader heading to the Deep South, to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where the work was so brutal that most slaves died within 7 years. This would get Samuel off his property and make him someone else's problem. But word traveled fast among enslaved communities. If Samuel ended up somewhere else and told his story, it would spread across the South. Other slaves would hear about the man who pretended to be weak and then humiliated a powerful plantation owner. It could inspire rebellions or escape attempts on multiple plantations. Thornton couldn't risk becoming famous as the fool who let a dangerous slave slip through his fingers. The third option was the one that kept Thornton awake all night. He could keep Samuel on the plantation but use him differently. Instead of hiding Samuel's abilities, he could exploit them. He could rebuild his fighting ring business by featuring Samuel as the main attraction. People would pay huge amounts of money to see the slave who moved like a ghost and defeated men twice his size. Thornton could make back all the money he lost, and more. But this option terrified him for a different reason. Keeping Samuel alive and making him famous meant giving power to a slave. It meant admitting that an enslaved person had value beyond simple labor. It went against everything the system of slavery was built on. While Thornton wrestled with his decision, something else was happening in the slave quarters. Word about the fight had already spread to every cabin on the plantation. The enslaved people whispered Samuel's name with a mixture of awe and hope. Some of them had always suspected there was something different about the quiet man who kept to himself. Now they knew the truth. Samuel had proven that their masters didn't know everything. He had shown that it was possible to hide strength, to wait for the right moment, and to strike back when the opportunity came. The elderly women who had felt sorry for Samuel and snuck him extra food now understood why he had survived. The men who thought he was weak now looked at him with respect. The children heard the story and tucked it away in their memories, a small flame of hope that maybe the powerful weren't as powerful as they seemed. Samuel had become a legend in a single night. And legends are dangerous things in a system built on keeping people hopeless and afraid. Thornton made his decision 3 days after the fight. He chose to keep Samuel, but in a way that would break him completely. He didn't kill him or sell him. Instead, he did something crueler. He isolated Samuel from the other enslaved people and put him in a small cabin alone, surrounded by armed guards, day and night. Thornton wanted to make sure Samuel couldn't talk to anyone or spread his story. He increased Samuel's work hours and gave him the hardest jobs on the plantation, trying to wear down his body and spirit. But Thornton had already lost, and he knew it. The story of the fight had escaped beyond his plantation's borders within days. Enslaved people who delivered goods to neighboring plantations whispered about what happened. House servants overheard their masters talking about Thornton's humiliation and repeated the story in the slave quarters. Within 2 weeks, Samuel's name was known across 3 counties. Within a month, variations of his story had spread to plantations in Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia. The legend grew with each telling. Some versions said Samuel defeated 10 men that night instead of 1. Other versions claimed he escaped and was living free in the North, helping other people find their way to freedom. The truth didn't matter as much as what the story represented. It became a symbol that the system of slavery wasn't as unbreakable as it seemed. It reminded people that they were more than what their masters saw. It planted seeds of resistance in places where hope had almost died. Samuel never fought in Thornton's ring again. Historical records from Natchez suggest that a slave matching Samuel's description disappeared from Thornton's plantation in early 1853. Some accounts claim he escaped during a transport to another property. Others say Thornton sold him quietly to a trader heading west, desperate to remove the reminder of his greatest humiliation. The truth about what happened to Samuel after that August night was lost to history. But James Thornton's fate was well documented. His fighting ring business never recovered. Other plantation owners stopped respecting him, and his social standing in Natchez society crumbled. He lost most of his wealth in bad business deals over the next few years. By 1857, he was forced to sell half his plantation to pay his debts. He died in 1864, bitter and alone, still haunted by the night when he chose the wrong slave to fight. The barn where the fight took place was torn down in 1866, right after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. But the story of what happened inside those walls lived on, passed down through generations as a reminder that strength comes in many forms, and that the powerful should never underestimate those they try to keep powerless. If you found this exploration into one of history's most powerful acts of hidden resistance moving, please leave a comment below. Which part of Samuel's journey touched you the most? Was it his 3 years of silent survival, pretending to be weak while hiding his warrior past? Or was it that shocking moment when he revealed his true strength and changed everything in just 10 seconds? Your engagement helps us bring these buried stories of courage and survival back to light. Do not forget to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy and hit the bell icon so you never miss our deep dives into the shadows of history. Your support ensures that stories like Samuel's fight against James Thornton are never forgotten, and that the names of those who resisted slavery in secret ways are finally told. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next story.